You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy.
And I'm Norm. And today we're going to be talking about The Wretched, which is a solo-only role-playing game. We're also going to be looking at the thematic tie-ins to the mechanics that the game uses, horror in games, different verbs that we use in games, such as board games and role-playing games, and the emotional investment that players are asked to take on in this game. Before we unpack that really broad topic, just a quick reminder that the Mage Night tournament is now into round number 3, which is really exciting. We're now into the final 8. This tournament is taking place on our Discord. We have lots of other fun things going on in the Discord, and just a reminder that it's free to join. Just follow the link in the description to join our Discord, and we'll see you over there. One other thing to mention before we dive into the main topic is Scruffy did a playthrough of The Wretched, which is now edited, and it is slick and really fun to listen to. It's over on his YouTube channel. The links to that are also in the description. Without any further ado, let's crack on with the episode. Scruffy, tell us a little bit about The Wretched.
Okay, yeah, so like Norm says, my playthrough of this is up on YouTube now. It was a very personal experience for me, and we'll unpack that in the episode. And I should just quickly throw out a little content warning here that the experience for both of us and the content of the game did take us to some fairly dark places, and it deals with hopelessness and themes like that. So just thought I'd make that clear. Okay, so it's quite a quick description for this game. It's pretty simple. Let's go over it now. The Wretched is a solo journaling RPG in which you take on the role of the last remaining crewmate aboard a spaceship named The Wretched, having just ejected a creature which killed the rest of your crew. The creature is still alive, however, clinging to the ship and trying to get in. You begin the game by setting up a stackable tower. I used a Jenga tower, a deck of playing cards, and a d6 dice. The game then instructs you to record your first log, following a short script in the rulebook. You can record the log however you like. We both chose to do audio logs. After this script is recorded, you will start the first day, rolling the d6, drawing that many cards from the deck, and turning them over to resolve their instructions one at a time. Each card will have a small narrative description in the rulebook, and you are encouraged to make notes on these experiences, answering any specifics to do with the situations that occur. After all the cards for the day have been encountered, you will record another audio log going through your notes on the day and what happened. The cards will often instruct you to remove a block from the stackable tower, and this tower represents your ship. If it ever falls, the game is over immediately and your ship explodes. There are other ways to lose the game too. For example, the creature could get in and kill you, and it is possible to win by fixing the engines or repairing the beacon and awaiting rescue. The mechanics for how to do this, however, are only reveal themselves as the game goes on and when you encounter certain cards. This means that you go in with a lack of concrete information on how you can get out of your situation, and you uncover it as you go. A mechanical connect which is perfect for you to have as it mirrors your character's situation perfectly. There we go. I couldn't even get through the description without praising this game because it's obviously one that I had a really, really fun time with. And like I said right from the start there, it was a very personal journey for me. And I think the mechanics of the system really allowed that to happen. And we'll go over that now. Did I miss anything in the description there? No.
I don't think so, Scruffy. I would say, I don't know if it says the ship explodes when Jenga Tower collapses. It says there's I think it says there's a massive systems failure.
So it could be anything. It could be like oxygen depletes and you can't breathe, or you can kind of...
Yeah, which I think takes us into the first thing I want to talk about, which is the cards, the deck of playing cards in the game. Of all the mechanics, it's probably what I want to talk about first, just because the reason that's important, the distinction I just made there, that when your Jenga tower falls, it's a massive systems failure rather than just an explosion. It might be an explosion, but it doesn't always have to be. Is because the cards do some really excellent foreshadowing with that kind of stuff. So I want to sort of unpack how that works. So did you mention in your description that there are how the different suits work in playing cards? I think
No, I haven't brought that up, no.
brilliant. So let's talk about that now. So I loved that the different suits had different meanings, and you become very familiar with them quite quickly. Did you also enjoy that?
Yeah, so the way it works is each suit kind of links to a specific thing to do with your situation. So I think spades are to do with the creature,
That's right.
diamonds are to do with the structure of the ship and the systems, and I can't remember what the other two are, but that sort of thing. Like one's to do with like the crew, isn't it? I think that's clubs. Is to do with your former crew, and yeah, when you draw them, you kind of automatically know what the specific prompt is going to be to do with, but you don't know the specifics about what it is to do with that.
My other favorite thing about the cards in particular is you mentioned how they tell you, give you your own piece of narrative instruction. You enter this space of the ship and this thing happens. But what they do really well is they also ask you a question.
Mm.
And it's often to do with relating it back to how this is personal to your character.
Mm.
There are often questions like, how does this make you feel? So, for an example, might be you find an important item that reminds you of a former crewmate. How does this make you feel? And you think, oh, okay, well, it made me feel lonely. And then you have to kind of think to yourself, well, why does it make me feel lonely? That's not the answer, right? I can't just say it makes me feel lonely. Oh, well, it makes me feel lonely because I'm reminded of my crewmate. And then you have to, in the fiction, make up your crewmate.
Yeah.
And one thing I did to make it easier is I use real names of people in my life. So I might use my mum's name. And then all of a sudden, I start to feel these emotions that my character's feeling because I'm thinking of what it would be like to live without my mother, which is a horrible feeling. And it allows you to really embellish on the fiction and also really almost like single-mindedly remind you throughout the game, this is how you should be feeling. You should be feeling lonely. You should be feeling hopeless. You should be feeling like you're in a horror movie. And if that doesn't sound fun to you, that's because it isn't.
No, I was absolutely buzzing when I finished playing this game, and the reason was because I went to places emotionally that I have never ever in my life gone to. I guess I'm pretty lucky in that I've never had to deal with any situation like this, where the whole way through the game you're having to confront a seemingly hopeless situation and obviously try and cling on to hope. I think we both went in with completely different approaches for our characters in the game. I decided to go in with the thought that my character was going to try and be optimistic throughout the whole thing. PMA, positive attitude all the way through. And I think that was a really great choice for me because it's naturally what I think me as a person would do anyway. So it was a natural response to the situations coming up. But when these situations come up and it asks you for the specific details, which you make a note of, and I was using a little notepad as I was going, and then you then come to record after all the rest of the experiences for the day, is really interesting, kind of looking back over it all and having to confront those things all over again as your character. Like you experienced it when you were writing it in the notebook in that moment, and then you experience it again with the next level of context, and then having to actually say it as the player. It was really quite something.
Yeah, and like you said, we had very different approaches. I tried something completely opposite. I know that the game's intention is to make you feel this feeling of hopelessness and loneliness, and and in order for that horror to come off and to pay off, I'm not an actor in any way, shape, or form. So I decided very early on that I was going to lean into the darkness. I was going to have my character feeling like he wants to give up. He can't imagine a way out. And that really framed the experience and took me in places that I didn't expect it to. And it was the first time in any role playing game, not just solo, but any role playing game at all, that I've experienced bleed. If you haven't heard the term bleed before in this context, it is the idea that the emotions that you feel in character then bleed over into your personal life and the emotions of you as a person, And I was kind of going around for the rest of the evening trying to do my really mundane tasks like make dinner and watch TV with my partner. And it was difficult because one part of my mind was still on The Wretched, it was still on this experience that I had and these places that I went to. And that sounds bad, but it wasn't. I had this like adrenaline rush,
Yes.
I was on this other cloud and it felt weird. I wanted to just talk about it to everyone. I wanted to guess what I just did. I just had this crazy experience. But of course, non-gamers don't tend to care. And even gamers, if they haven't played it, they won't be able to empathize. So I'm glad that you enjoyed it as well, Scruffy.
It's nice hearing you say the same thing because it's really hard to communicate a feeling like that, isn't it? It's very hard to communicate something that is so transformative and so personal. Like, I know that we will have felt, I suppose, a fairly similar level of intense feeling, but it will have been unique and personal to us and our specific situation and our specific mindset and how we deal with this situation. And the fact that the game pulls that out of you, that it manages to get you to not only, because even though the stakes are really low, you're not actually on this spaceship, but you're having to actually say the words as though you are. And I ended up just saying in one of my logs, just one day at a time, and that was not just my character saying just one day at a time. It was me as the player saying just one day at a time. That is the only way I can envision winning. I just need to take these cards one day at a time, and that and that's all I can do. That's the only way I can approach this situation without just giving up. And yeah, it's really hard to put into words how that felt. That I felt like I was completely, for the first time ever in any RP, that I was completely and totally well, not totally, obviously, because I'm not actually on the spaceship, but I was in sync in terms of my thought processes. Like me and my character were both thinking the same thing and using the sort of suspension of disbelief and allowing myself to be immersed in that allowed me to feel it to some degree, which was a huge thing for me personally. It was the perfect next step on my solo RP journey because it's something I've never considered that can happen from a solo RP experience.
Yeah, this is very, very, very different to what we covered last time when we looked at a solo RPG, which was Iron Swan. We can get into the differences in a moment, but yeah, I want to circle back to something you mentioned about the connect between your character and yourself. One element of the game that absolutely nails this, and I'm so glad it exists, is the physical recording of your audio. So the game suggests that you can log it on paper or you can log it by video or you can log it by audio, but it recommends to log it by video or by audio. And that's my biggest recommendation from this episode. Make sure you do that. If you can go on to any recording, just use your phone if you haven't got anything else. It's so important because as you're playing the game and you're drawing these cards, you're seeing what happens in the narrative, you're thinking about what that means to you and you're making notes so you don't forget. It's not until you then have to say them aloud and actually act as your character in a way that you probably wouldn't with other solo role-playing games. I certainly don't when I play Iron Sworn, for example. Certainly don't talk out loud. I certainly don't walk around the room acting as my character. But the performative connect between what your character is doing in the narrative and what you're doing in real life is the abstraction is zero. If I said to you, Scruffy, in this game, I am on my own and I'm recording audio logs. Am I talking about, you wouldn't know whether I'm talking about me as a character or me as a player because the expression is perfect for both.
Yeah.
And that really brings out the emotion, like Scruffy was saying, because you have to not just think about how your character feels, but you then have to explain as your character how you're feeling in the moment. And yeah, that really, all the emotions start to come out. A couple of times I got choked up and I felt really...
Me too.
I felt kind of silly, but also amazed that I allowed myself to have that kind of experience with a RP. Sorry, Scruffy, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
Sorry, I was just going to say that I totally agree that So it feels like with something like Iron Sworn, it feels like you're writing a story and there is a layer of disconnect between you and your character. You can get immersed and you can get immersed in the fiction, in the world and things, but I never felt that I could get quite as immersed with that form as I did with this. So it feels like there's almost two games in one with this Wretched game, that you're writing the logs and that feels very typical from my solo experience of like, okay, there's a situation, I write a thing, and I should quickly mention the game that feels quite quick, even though that took up the longest part of the game for me. It feels like that's just something you're sort of bustling through and being creative to get to the important stuff, which is then the logs, because that's the bit where you start role playing, like really, really role playing, or at least that was my experience of it. And it felt a bit silly for the first 1 or maybe 2 days. It felt a bit like, obviously it's a completely new thing I've never done before. But by the third or fourth day, I was wrapped up, like, and just completely lost my sense of self, and sort of blurred between the me that was talking and the me that I was talking as and for, which was my character. Did you feel the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if I could give advice, because when we do these shows, we often get, in the Discord afterwards or by email or whatever, people say, well, when I play this game, I have trouble with X, Y, and Z. What do you advise? So if I could give any advice on this, it would be to throw yourself into the acting with the logs, and the emotions and the horror will come. There's I used to work in like telesales when I was first out of school, and there's an old expression: "Smile while you dial," because if you put on the smile, eventually you will feel happy. Eventually that will have an effect on you, and it will come through on the phone. And as dystopian as that sounds, because why can't you just be happy yourself anyway? There's truth in that. I didn't feel the emotions of my character on day one or day two, but I was still acting as if I were. And that really helped me get into my character's head, because eventually the emotions came afterwards. This probably sounds really crude, especially if you're at all into drama. And I'm speaking to Scruffy, who studied drama. That probably sounds really crude, but for me, who knows nothing, that was a really easy way for me to get into the character's mindset and allow myself to experience the horror that this game is trying to make you feel. What I don't know if you have any.
Not crude at all. I mean, I've met very few people. I mean, one or two sort of, I guess, geniuses that are able to just snap into a character and feel that feeling straight away. But I think for almost everyone, you need to start from a position of disconnect and eventually merge with your character. Like, and it always takes me a very long time to do that. I always have a real difficulty in all RPs, whether solo or not, finding my character and feeling with my character. And this is the first time that happened so quickly, that I got so wrapped up in it. By the last day that I recorded, I was absolutely unaware of the world around me. Like the room kind of just blurred out of existence. It was something really special. It sounds a bit magical talking about it, and it was magical for me. And it was, there's no other word for it. It was a transformative experience. And I think you're right that only comes from taking that kind of leap of faith as the player, diving in, committing to it, and not being afraid to be specific. I did a similar thing to you. I brought in names of, well, only one person I know, and that's your name, Norm, just because I thought it'd be fun at the start. But it actually really did help to sort of have a name there, give that person a name, give that person a backstory, give my, and that kind of emerges through the prompts of the cards. And then other names came out as well, which was fine, even though I didn't have them tied to a specific person in my life. It's still, they were real to my character and therefore to me. I think specificity is always good because it helps ground things. But I think it also stops you having to worry about directing yourself. And at the start, you're kind of like, oh, am I doing that right? Or am I being a bit melodramatic? Oh, would my character actually say this? But if you just kind of just put that to one side and just say what feels natural, then if you're anything like me or you, Norm, then you do get wrapped up in it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a combination of those two things, the cards and the questions that they ask, so that you genuinely have to sit and consider and flesh out what has happened on this ship, and like you said, the specificity.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that the cards in this game, obviously a lot hinges on them. And I think they are all the ones that I encountered were really, really good prompts. That they sometimes ask quite a lot from you, but you can always invest as much or as little detail in them as you want. You can just copy and paste them piecemeal from the rule book into the notepad and just read them literally word for word as they are on the thing. And for some of them, that's fine. But then others will inspire you, and most, in fact, for me, inspired me to come up with a detail. Or even if I just went, okay, that'll do as a detail, then I drew another card and was like, oh my god, that connects to the last card.
Because you make the connection, don't you? You make the connection. We
Yeah.
spoke about this last time. We spoke about Iron Swan. It's projection. When you play games like these, you have to project onto it where you want the story to go anyway. And you kind of go into it with that. So I went in with a couple of things that I knew were going to happen. I came in with a very specific idea of how my creature was going to work. Before I came in, I said the creature is going to be telepathic and it's going to communicate with my character through thoughts. And that's going to be an interesting thing for me to explore. That's the first time I played it. I played it twice. I'll get into why I didn't play it more than twice in a moment, because it's a very interesting game in terms of replayability.
I was going to ask about that. I'm glad you're bringing it up.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll come back on to that in a moment. So I only came in with that, really. That was that's the preconception I had. One is that the creature was going to be telepathic, and we'll see what happens with that. And the second one was that my character was going to be leaning into the darkness and leaning into the loneliness and not have that positive mental attitude that your character had, Scruffy. Those are the only two preconceptions, but the rest all come naturally through the cards. And because of the ideas you have going into it, you project, you make connections. Oh, this card is obviously referring to that time I come across Scruffy's body and I found his key card, even though it's not, it is just a specific but vague suggestion. You connect it to what you've already made up in the fiction and becomes self-referencing. Would you agree with that, Scruffy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that certain prompts lend the story to a certain conclusion. Like my monster ended up being, I don't want to spoil too much about my thing in case you guys haven't listened to it yet. And I'd love it if you would, because like I say, it was a really personal thing for me. And I think it turned out as quite an interesting and engaging story. But my monster ended up being telepathic as well, and that wasn't something I went in with any preconceptions for. So perhaps certain cards invite those sort of things. I don't know, because I have only played the game once, and the reason I've only played the game once is that I didn't want to detract from that first experience, and I wanted to leave a lot of time before I play again so that I've forgotten what some of the cards are, and it allows me to have a different experience. I really, 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 really enjoyed my experience. Now, I have played the Wasteland version, and we'll get onto that a bit later if we have time, but it was nowhere near the same sort of experience that this one offered for me. Like, not even close. In fact, I abandoned my playthrough partway through. I didn't enjoy it at all.
Interesting.
So for your replayability of this game, what did you find in your second playthrough? Because I'm really interested in knowing if it detracted from your first playthrough view, if you felt that there was a lot of similar experiences. Did you get all the way through it? How did it feel?
Yeah, I got all the way through it. I got all the way through it in that I died. If that's what you mean. But yeah, playing it more than once is interesting because the prompts are they feel very specific. And they're specific enough that when I played for a second time, I was like, oh, it's this card again. I remembered all of them. I was like, oh, yes, I've seen this one before. There was no kind of, I forgot that. It's not like rolling on the Oracle in Iron Swan, where even if you do roll the same things, they're so vague that you've given the context of your situation, it feels different. The Wretched is so tightly contained by comparison. You are on a ship, there is a creature outside, there's only so much you can add variety in those things. And the way I tackled it is I said, okay, well, my last two preconceptions were I was going to have a negative mindset and I was going to have a telepathic creature. kind of like an other dimension type creature. The second time I played, I said, well, why don't I change those two preconceptions entirely and see if that gives the cards a new context to me? And that's the only way I could think of tackling the problem.
I think that's a really good way of doing it.
Thanks. So what I did is I said, well, the creature is going to be not so hard to understand, not so kind of otherworldly. This creature is going to behave like a creature. It's going to be motivated by food. It's going to be motivated by surviving, and it wants to kill me for the primal reason of eating me. That couldn't be more different to my first creature, which was kind of, a unspeakable horror from another dimension, kind of Lovecraftian, if you will.
Yeah.
And I said my character is going to be pragmatic, and it's going to try to get through the situation and focus on the end goal of surviving. And those two things were very opposite. Did it lead to a different play experience? No.
Really?
Yeah.
Even though your logs were being recorded with less emotion, I suppose, less fixation on the darkness, it was still a similar experience.
It was a worse experience.
Okay.
It was lessened, and it might not be the delivery. It might just be because I knew a lot of the cards.
Yeah. This is why I haven't come back to it, because I think I imagine that would be how I'd feel going in. I can't imagine reaching that high again and getting that invested in a character again, unless, I think your idea of changing a few of the preconceptions is a really good call, but I think you need a fundamental shift and maybe even a whole new set of prompts. I don't know. I don't know if this game is at all replayable.
Yeah, this is it. So playing again, I realized. So playing the first time, it was a two-way conversation, me and the game, and it was this really immersive, dark, twisted, emotional experience, full of surprises. The second time playing, I realized that I was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. I was the one who was trying to think of the variety. I was the one who was going, well, last time I did this with this card, potentially this time I'll do this instead.
Yeah. Takes you out of it, but having to direct so much.
Yeah, it certainly does take you out of it. It's no longer a two-way conversation. It's kind of like looking back through an old conversation, listening to somebody else's playthrough and thinking about how you'd do it differently. That's
Oh,
how
okay.
And I don't know if other people have a similar experience. If you know The Wretched, let me know. I will say this. I did it the next day because I was so excited. I did it the next day. That probably didn't help. I wonder what my opinion would be if I left it a couple of months and came back.
Yeah, maybe I should put a little a spoiler warning on my YouTube video to say, if you haven't played the game, maybe play it first, just so you don't get anything ruined.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea, Scruffy, because if you have any intention of playing a game, knowing what the cards are kind of a big part of it. I will say though, it's probably safer to listen to your playthrough and then go play it than it is to play it twice in a row. And that's because although you might know what the cards are, the logging of your audio is still a completely new experience. It's not something that players are asked to do a lot in games. So for that reason, it might still be perfectly fine. So I think you should feel free to listen to Scruffy's before you play the game. But I would probably advise, if I was going to have my perfect Wretched experience, it would be just download the game and dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I just want to go back and into the mechanics and how they link to the stakes of the game, and why I think that the game has so much of an impact and is able to feel so real and give me a sense of stakes, even though I'm just RPing and there's no actual consequences for me. So obviously, to start with, I think the investment in potentially getting a happy ending is huge. And I think that feeling that things might work out for me because I'm special, and for my character because they're special, it makes it real. It feels like, despite everything that's going on, you want to win because you can see how difficult it is to win, and then what a story you'd have to tell everyone else who's played the game and anyone who'd listen.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say whether my thing won, whether I did win or not. No spoilers here, but I think that that's a big thing. And more importantly than that, even, that my backstory, for example, for my character, only came out day 7 into my logs, I drew a card that asked me to describe what happened, or invited me to describe what happened, right? I don't remember what it specifically said, but it felt right to do that. And so I wrote a whole I wrote a whole thing in my notes, and I said it in the thing, and I said, this is what happened. I'm going to say the story, and here are all the people. Somebody sacrificed themselves. This is how it all panned out. That story wouldn't have existed if I'd knocked the Jenga tower over a day early.
Or if you didn't draw the card, even.
Yeah. So the investment in surviving is one of discovery. So the more you live, the more you learn about your character, about this world that you're creating as you go, and about yourself and those feelings. And just knowing that the moment, if the tower gets knocked over, or if you lose another way, or even if you succeed, the moment the game ends, but especially if it ends abruptly, that takes away from you a chance to discover any more. That life, even though it's a fictional life, is over, and that world is over, and you'll never learn any more about it. That's a real stake to me. So the feeling of knocking that tower over accidentally and ending your game, it's one that is a real loss to you, like an actual tangible loss, because you no longer have a chance to play that game and learn any more about that character and interact with that side of yourself.
That's a really good point, Scruffy. It's not something that I had managed to put into words or write down in any of my show notes.
It's a complicated thing to try and communicate, but it's really true, and it's something that I really noticed. Like every time I started to take a tile from the tower, and I was feeling dread that it might fall over.
Yes. So one of the show notes was I wrote about, we should speak about the Jenga tower and how it really adds dread to the game. And it's funny that we say that, because obviously the first system that, to my knowledge, introduced the Jenga tower in a role-playing game
It's dread, yeah.
Is dread. Yeah. So I suppose it makes sense. But I couldn't put into words why it brought on those feelings of dread. And I think you just nailed it. It was that sense of, well, the story ends and I want to know what happens. It's not just I want to win. I do agree with you that the game does incentivize you to want to win, and I think in the rule book it frames it really well, because it makes it sound like a really difficult achievement. It frames the game like you are in a hopeless situation, but you could make it through, and that does motivate you to want to survive. But the more powerful motivator is the one of discovery. I want to know what happens. I want to flesh out my character more. I'm in this now. I'm in this. And it doesn't take long to get into it. The whole playthrough, the whole experience, I would say wraps up in about 2 hours. Would you agree with that, Scruffy?
Yeah, the game says that it takes half an hour. I don't know how you could play it in half an hour. It took me 2 hours. Most of that, well, when I edited down my audio logs, they came out to, and I didn't edit them much. Like I only took out the blank spaces where I wasn't talking. So it's pretty much verbatim what I recorded. I thought that was important. But that ended up being 40 minutes. So the remaining 1 hour 20 was just taking notes in my logs and drawing the cards and playing the game. So yeah, about 2 hours for me.
Yeah, and same. And I played it twice. The first time was just a little over 2 hours, and the second time was just a tiny bit under, like 1 minute 50 or something. And yeah, it packs a lot of punch. If all you're going to get out of this game is a 2-hour experience and you're never going to play it again, it's still very much worth it, I think, Scruffy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my main takeaway is that it made me feel things that I've not felt before. And if that's not the point of an RP, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
It fills a very specific function in that, it's not very replayable, like we've just talked about potentially. I mean, unless I think it's missing a kind of module to allow replayability, where you're able to give it a different framing, a different context or something. But in some ways, that even enhances it, because all the way through, I knew, like I was realizing as I was going, I'm not going to be able to play this again. because I'm not every card I drew. With every single new card I drew, I realized I got further and further away from being able to have a unique experience next time, and that just upped the stakes even more. For when this game is over, this game is over for me, and
Yeah,
maybe I'll be able to revisit it after a time away, and maybe if I can reframe it. But the fact that that doesn't exist yet enhances the experience.
yeah, it definitely increases the stakes. I was telling myself, look, you idiot, don't wobble the tower, pull it
Yeah,
steady.
exactly. Yeah, and
because
and
because you're not going to have this experience again. That was absolutely it. A couple of other things that make it really unique as a role playing game. Before I move on, there's a couple of other things we want to talk about in this podcast. But before we move on from the mechanics, there's a couple of other things that make it quite unique. If you haven't played a journaling style role playing game before, if your usual fare with role playing games are things like Dungeons and Dragons, a couple of things that will make it different. First one, and it's quite a big one, there's no character sheet. The game doesn't ask you to build your character. It just asks you to, and that helps make it more personal because the cards say, "How does it make you feel?" And then where's the gap? There's no gap. There's no piece of paper saying, "Well, that's me. I'm me." You know?
the fact that they don't have a +3 in charisma, which you don't have as a person, means that you're more able to slip into their skin
Yeah,
because there isn't that barrier there. If I'm playing an orc warrior in D&D, I know I'm not an orc warrior in real life, so I'm able to have that disconnect. Whereas this character is a blank canvas who could easily be me.
yeah, absolutely, and it allows you to project yourself onto them, and then
I think it helps that I gave my character the nickname Scruffy as well. So
yeah, I didn't even come up with a unique name. I just said Flight Engineer Norm.
I think that's a good idea. If you can make it personal, you should.
And it works really well because you're not going to play a whole campaign with your friends saying Flight Engineer Norm or whatever your own name is. You're just going to do it for this 2 hour experience where you are aiming, where the aim is to create a personal story and have it affect you in a very personal way. So yeah, if I can give a little bit more advice, I feel like an agony aunt just giving out advice in this episode. But if I can give any more advice, if to give you your perfect wretched experience, don't think too much about the name. Don't roll on a random name generator. Just say it's you. Just it's you.
Yeah.
It is you on that ship.
It's interesting. I get the temptation to do it because I think we both had such a profound experience with this that we want to share that and say, here's how you can capture it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally makes sense that you'd want to give that advice.
Yeah, and another thing that we already spoken about is the Jenga tower. How I don't track the ship's stats using a tick box or a track that ticks down. It's a physical thing in front of me that I can see. I can see the vulnerability of the ship as well.
Yeah, and you don't know how many moves. You don't know that it's got 10 HP and it's down to 6. You don't know. There's no certainty there. It just looks a bit wobbly now.
Yeah, it just looks fucked.
And I don't know if you ever had this experience, but when I was doing my recording, at one point, I was like, trying to work out what to do. And this was the one day at a timeline. And I looked over at the tower before I said, I was like, what am I going to do next in my head? And I looked over at the tower and saw how bleak it was looking. And that's when I was like, just one day at a time. That's all I can do. One day at a time. I can just keep that in my mind. It's just keep that tower up one more day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and another thing that is quite unique about this as a role playing game, perhaps not as a journaling role playing game, but again, speaking to those who haven't played this type of game before, it is so easy to learn and get playing.
Mm.
There is no rules overhead at all. Scruffy has actually told you the rules in the description. You do just read the script for day one, you roll a dice, you draw that many cards, and then you flip them over and you do your log. Those are the rules.
Having said that, I don't think it's a great RP as your first solo RP because it's so unique. And I think I'm really glad I encountered it after I encountered Ironswarm because I don't know what I would have done not having that baseline of knowing that an RP can be an adventure and a journey, not just this intense personal emotional experience. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, in no way would I recommend this as your first. Oh, but by all means, if you haven't played one before and you're tempted to try it, go ahead. But just know that you can play a D&D esque campaign structure game. In many ways, it transcends what even multiplayer RPs do, because I've never played a multi. In the last episode on solo role playing, when we spoke about Ironsworn, we spent a lot of time talking about the things you lose from multiplayer to solo and how we felt about that and how the game deals with it. And it's very clever in the way it does it, and I still absolutely adore Iron Swan, and my feelings on that haven't changed one iota. However, this is a really different episode. We're talking about things that, hey, these don't even exist in multiplayer RPGs. These are stuff that you can't do in multiplayer RPGs. You can't be alone on a ship logging your daily logs like you are in real life in this game. So in many ways, it's an experience above a multiplayer experience, which is fun to say, because last time round we were speaking very much about how it compares to multiplayer. And in this episode, it's very much this is a bunch of stuff you can't even do multiplayer,
Yeah.
which is fun. It shows off the genre really well. But on the subject of the logs and on the subject of the Jenga tower, I wanted to bring up a concept that I actually discovered listening to another podcast, the Ludology podcast. And I wanted to bring up how this game reminded me of that concept and just share it with you guys as listeners, and yourself as well, Scruffy, to get your thoughts, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, listeners, go ahead and treat yourself to Ludology episode 230. It's a great episode, but the basic concept was they were talking about different verbs in board games and how there are two sets of verbs. One thing that the player is doing in real life, the thing that you are doing. Are you rolling dice? Are you drawing cards? Are you placing meeples? What is it you as the player are doing? Are you writing on your character sheet, for example, to use a role playing example? And then there's the thing that you are doing in the game. So when you write on your character sheet -1, that represents a more complex verb, which is you've just been stabbed or you're under attack, or rolling dice can be as many different things, from resolving a battle to growing vegetables in your garden and everything in between. And it's interesting, the general principle of that episode was there are many, many different verbs, secondary verbs, verbs you're doing in the game, the things that your characters are doing. But there aren't very many primary verbs. There aren't very many interesting things you will physically do as a player. And this is a really good example of a game with very unique physical actions, intricate little physical actions. You roll a dice and you draw cards like you do in many, many countless other games. But there's a Jenga tower sat in front of you which represents a ship. Like, wow. That's so unique.
I think it's important to point out there that, I mean, all of this links to the idea of a performative connect, that you are trying to do a similar thing to what your character is doing. And the Jenga tower is perfect because what your character is trying to do is they're trying to repair the ship. So it's a tangible thing involving delicate operations and moving things. But also, on an emotional and on a meta level, they're trying to delicately keep themselves okay, keep themselves alive, and avoid anything going wrong. And that's what you're trying to do with a Jenga tower. You're trying to avoid it spilling over and something going wrong, right?
But the important thing is, although there's a really, really lovely performative connect, there is still an abstraction. It would mean it wouldn't be as effective if when you bought The Wretched, it came with all these electrical pieces that you actually had to fix in real life and there were instructions. That, even though it is more thematic, would not be as effective. It would take you out of the game. So the abstraction level is perfect. It's enough to where it doesn't take you out of the game, but it's still thematically tied in well enough that it means something to the players, and that's perfect in my opinion. And just going back to just the idea of doing more interesting things physically, not just rolling dice and drawing cards, but doing something different. I remember Rob from our Discord, I post a picture of when I was playing The Wretched. And I said, "Oh, look, guys, I'm playing The Wretched." And he was like, "Oh, cool." And then he realized that the Jenga tower wasn't just in the background, it was a part of the game. And all of a sudden, he became very interested. He was like, "Whoa, are you guys covering that on the show?" It's interesting to people. People enjoy doing new things. And this game really shows that off really well, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that the cards are good as well because I mean I don't know if you found this too, but having them come up felt almost like the display on a computer screen. The fact that they're so visual and so popping, and that they're just an arcane number that you don't have to look up in the manual. That action of referencing a number with a thing, it's almost like the first steps on if you're sat in that chair on the spaceship, getting the error report coming in and having to work out where it is so you know what you've got to deal with. I mean,
that is a connect that I wasn't able to make. I think you're just more dramatically inclined than I am, Scruffy.
well, I mean, I didn't really. It wasn't like as quite as visceral as the Jenga tower, but I think it's important that it's so quick and so snappy, and that it
Yes.
gets you to where you want to go. And you know, I felt like having the computer screens here and working with it, it was all very good.
Perfect. I want to ask you, Scruffy, about Wasteland, because there are
Okay,
just for the sake of our listeners, there are lots of different games that use these mechanics, and I will send over a link to itch.io where they did a what they called a wretched and alone jam, and there are nearly 100 games that use these similar mechanisms. So if this sounds interesting to you, but you think, "Oh, actually, I don't want to experience horror. I really appreciate what you guys are saying, but I don't want to feel those emotions. I don't want to be on a ship." Click on that link, and it will take you to a bunch of different themes and aesthetics that you can use for your own play. And one of the examples is Wretched the Wasteland. Scruffy, you've played it. I haven't. What's it like?
so this one's inspired by kind of a Fallout sort of world, and that's right up my alley. And disclaimer before I kind of nag all over it because I didn't enjoy my experience of it. I just want to say that I love that it exists, and I love that there's all those other systems there, and that people have been inspired by the Wretched system to make more games like it. I think that I'm going to have to start trawling through them because I really want to find more games like the Wretched. And like we've already discussed in the episode, the fact that it doesn't have so much replayability means that these systems are kind of integral to the longevity of the game. That being said, I did not like The Wasteland, and there are kind of three main reasons why I didn't like it. The first is that there was a mechanical and thematic disconnect, specifically a lot of the time to do with the cards. So it would say you'd have cards that said things like, "You discover a bunker. Do you choose to stay in the bed?" And that's an okay prompt. But then the mechanical reward for that was that you get to roll a re-roll on your next movement, which didn't make any sense to me. Like, if you're staying in a bunker, why would you get an increase in your movement in the future? The Jenga tower in this game is also meant to represent your body, your health, your mind state. And I had a moment where, for example, I got shot and didn't have to take a block from the Jenga tower, but I did have to take one off when I inhaled some smoke. Bizarre. Yeah, so that wasn't great. And there are also times, and this moves on to my second point, there are also times where it says that you can choose to take a block from the Jenga tower. So the mechanics pull you away from interesting or consistent stories, because why would I choose to do that unless it made sense within the fiction to do that? But then I'm incentivized to make, because I control the fiction, I'm incentivized to make it not make sense in the fiction, to make a more boring interaction with that card prompt. It doesn't quite make any sense. Like, why would you encourage players to pull away from interesting or impactful moments by saying, you know, you'll be essentially taking an extra hit if you make this trigger, this card, a big deal. Whereas if you just downplay it, you can just skip taking a hit on your Jenga tower. Bizarre again, you know, that felt really, really weird to me. And then I think the third, and I think probably maybe the most important problem for me, is one of pacing. In this game, the overarching story is that you are being chased by raiders and you're trying to get back to your camp. And then there are cards that ask you to start describing strange flora that's appearing. I'm not going to stop and smell the flowers within this context. What a weird situation. I'd come across random groups of people doing stuff and stop and watch them do their little ritual and stuff. Why am I stopping and looking at the sights along the wasteland when I'm being chased by raiders? It felt really, really weird. I mean, going back to the bunker thing, why would I stay in the bunker when I'm being chased? It felt really bizarre. Like, why have that as the overarching story? Why not have it just that you're trying to survive in the wasteland, and then you can stop and smell the roses, and maybe you're heading somewhere specific? But this whole concept of you being chased felt like I was trying to rush throughout the game, and felt like a lot of the prompts made even less sense. It made it feel very strange.
Sounds like you and the game were working against each other a lot of the time.
Exactly, yeah. I think that's the kind of the heart of it, and that's why I didn't get on with it. So yeah, I don't want to linger on this one too much, because, like I say, I really love the ambition. And if you can get any sort of pleasure from it, great. But for me, it took the kind of concepts of the other one, and then the choices they made with the new context and the choices they made with the specifics on the cards totally fell down. I think you need to put a lot of thought into what those cards are saying and how they make sense within the meta narrative of the setup of the story.
Okay, yeah, that sounds perfectly reasonable. I haven't played the game myself, so I can't disagree with you like I normally do.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, just moving back to The Wretched, because this is something I've been struggling with. I just want to know, why do you think that it feels so different from, say, watching a movie? How come both of us were able to confront our psyche in a more real and immediate way than when we, for example, watch a movie, watch TV, or play a narrative driven video game? Even, I guess what I'm getting at is it sort of the feeling, the illusion of control? Is it that you are part of the creative process, that it's personal? I genuinely can't kind of pin it down to one thing that sort of takes it to a more personal level, because we empathize with characters in movies, we empathize with our characters when we're playing other games. So why is this one more personal?
Well, I don't know if it is more personal. Don't mean to be contrary, but I've played a lot of video games. I haven't. Let me just scratch that. I don't play a lot of video games, but when I have played video games, especially horror video games, I find them really immersive, and it takes very little time at all for me to experience the terror that my character is feeling.
Okay.
So I don't think it is more, but it doesn't have to be more. It doesn't have to be less. These are different experiences. Personally, I think the reason it feels so different, and the reason I had bleed for the rest of the evening, where I wouldn't with a video game, and I guess you could say that is more, but it didn't feel more intense in during the process. But I guess I'm getting off point. The reason it feels different, I think, is because something you alluded to just there. You're a part of the process. This all came from my mind. All these dark things that I said and did in this game, I thought of those. I made those happen. That's quite shocking, but I had to confront those types of emotions, and that all came from my own brain, and that shocked me. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was so affected for the rest of the day. And you don't have that with a video game. Does that make sense at all, Scruffy?
Yeah, I think it does. I think maybe it's just that it's something that took me somewhere that other media has not taken me yet. And obviously, yeah, I'm not saying that media and other games and other things I've watched or plays I've seen where haven't made me have that same feeling of going somewhere new in myself and discovering new things. But I just wondered why specifically this one did it. And I guess you're right. It must be to do with that you are the architect of the, I guess you'd say, horror and emotional pull and emotional drive of the story, which makes it even more personal, like a dream.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. Absolutely. And that kind of bleed that you have from a dream where you wake up and you go, "Oh, that was awful. Oh, I can't really remember specifics, but you remember the feeling." And it was the same with The Wretched. I wasn't sat there thinking, and then this happened. I just remembered the feeling. And Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. It's a really good question. I don't know if I can answer it any better than I have done there.
No, I think you've given us a lot to think about.
Shall we move on to the next part of the show where we look?
Yes, I think we've covered the wretched there. Hopefully, you guys got something out of our little chat about that and know where we stand on the wretched now. It's amazing. It's so spooky.
So, Scruffy, before we read out the responses from last episode, let's go ahead and ask our listeners a new question this time round. What is that question?
Okay, the question this episode is: what is the most affecting moment you've had in a game? So, by that, what I mean is a moment that made you feel something very personal and perhaps something that you don't normally feel in your day to day life.
And if you can't remember the specifics of the story, just let us know the game and why you think the game was able to pull that out of you, what it done, how it
Mm.
framed the experience for you. This could be a role playing game, a video game, a board game, a made up game that you played with your kids,
Yeah.
or whatever. But yeah, a time that you were really affected by playing a game. We'd love to know because this certainly was the most I've been affected by a role playing game for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Iron Sworn. When I had the conclusion of my character and he died, it felt impactful, but it didn't take me quite as far into my own psyche as this did, and into that intimate conversation with myself that I've never had to have before, and that was the wretched number one for me, the most affecting moment I've had in a game. I've been scared in games. I've played Subnautica and weed myself when the Reaper came at me, but not. I've not had to then really confront it. Well, I guess it's to a lesser extent. It's not a binary, is it? But yeah, that's kind of what we mean by affecting something that took you to somewhere new for yourself, somewhere out of your comfort zone.
Great. So the first response we got actually came from our Discord. Now, I normally read out emails only, but I think I'm going to stop doing that because we get a lot of people. Like the purpose of the Discord is for people to respond to the show, right?
Mm.
And just chat amongst themselves. And we even have a specific dedicated channel called Podcast where people can put their responses. And it seems weird that I'm not then reading those out on the show. Feels like
I love our Discord. It's just such a great place.
genuinely my favorite gaming community online. And I know that's biased because we started it, but it doesn't feel like our community. It feels like community all of it itself because you guys are so nice. But the first one I got was from he's on the Discord as Rob the Game Guy. And he wrote in about Iron Sworn specifically, and he had some thoughts on solo role playing and how it compares to multiplayer role playing, specifically from a GM's point of view. Just thought you'd find this interesting, Scruffy.
Okay.
Says, I've definitely got the Iron Sworn itch. I just have so many projects and games, so it's in my queue now for sure. Also wanted to add that the solo RPG hobby sounds a lot like the experience I have when building sessions for my campaigns that I DM or GM. I'm talking about prep time, not play time specifically. So during prep, if he's not sure where to go with the story, he might roll some dice. He might use some random generators. He might look at some exploration tables. He mentioned a couple called Donjon, which is spelled Donjon, Kobold Fight Club, and many others as well. And sometimes it surprises him and takes him in directions he didn't anticipate. And half the time, the players will never get to even experience those little twists and turns that he didn't anticipate. So he's looking forward to solo role playing because he's going to explore those twists and turns that his players don't normally when they go in a different direction. I was just wondering what you think about the similarities between preparing or GMing and playing a game like Iron Sworn.
Yeah, I must have missed that comment, but that's really interesting because it sounds like he's experiencing a story like he's playing a solo RP while he's creating the game, doing the narrative twists and turns. He's not a character necessarily, more a sort of ghost moving through the narrative, I imagine, or hypothetical characters. I don't know if he uses his players as surrogates, imagining the choices they'll make and things. But for sure, it sounds like you'll get a real kick out of Ironsworn. That's almost exactly what it's like. I've only GM once before, and I was pretty rubbish at creating a story. I never really sat down and did it properly, so I can't say how much it mirrors up. Maybe that's something I'll have to do if I do decide to GM for other players again, or even just use one of my solo experiences and have them follow the same path. That'd be a really good way to prep a session, wouldn't it? Play a solo game yourself and then just have their characters come in and see what they do differently.
I feel like it's the solo role-playing experience that I've had has certainly made me more confident to GM. If someone said to me, I want to play this game, would you GM? Before, I'd have been quite reluctant. I can GM, but
You're a great GM, Norm.
thank you. I struggle. It doesn't come easy to me. It doesn't come natural. But solo role-playing has allowed me to think on the fly so much more, and I'm amazed at the coherent and deep narratives that come out of that kind of on-the-fly thinking. That it's made me just a little bit more confident to be like, well, you know what? If you're not very good at preparing for a session, that's fine, because the players are going to give you input that you can cope with and roll with because you do it all the time by yourself. And if someone was to say to me now, I want to play a one shot or a campaign with your GM, if I had if timing wasn't an issue, if the only issue was confidence and competency, I'd be much more confident, and that all comes from playing solo role playing. So that's an unexpected benefit that I didn't foresee, which is pretty cool, I think.
That's awesome.
Had some more. So we got a couple of other responses from the episode that we did last time on Pax Premier and Atomadex. One of which that I would like to read out is from Banana Republic, who said, "Great podcast again this week. I just finished it. I love listening to your analysis because whenever I play, I tend not to think too much about my Atoma opponent, at least not super critically. I don't think about what my Atoma opponent could have done better, etc. So it was very eye-opening to see this kind of analysis, which I thought was quite nice of him to say.
That's really lovely of you, Banana. Thanks. And I hope you got a kick out of playing PAX Premier.
And we also had another one from Comrade Boris, who says, yes, great episode. Regarding Gaia Project, I agree that the mine placement requires a bit of work, but I believe this was the first Atoma Factory implement of their 2-card system and a starting deck which new cards get added to throughout the game. I believe Scruffy would prefer this system versus something like the Chronobot, since the 2-card system uses face-up card that informs the player what the Atoma might do next turn without a clear sense of what the possibilities are.
Yes, I remember seeing this comment, and yeah, I agree. I think you probably got me nailed there. That I definitely need to try out Gaia Project, and when we do return to AIs, I'm almost certain that's the one we'll probably tackle. Is that fair to say, Norm?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, we got a lot more comments over on the Discord and feedback from the episode, but those were some of the ones I thought were quite interesting and thought we could obviously talk about here. That's probably it for responses. So do we just want to remind the listeners what the question was for this episode?
So the question this episode is, what is the most affecting moment you've had in a game?
Yep, and remember you can write in as always by email. It's alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. You can join the Discord and you can give your feedback on our podcast channel. The links to join our Discord are in the description. It's free. What are you waiting for? You can also reach out on Facebook and on Instagram. We're at alwaysplayer1podcast on Instagram. The links to our Facebook are also in the description. And finally, if you want to support the show, we have a Patreon. Sign up to Patreon at www.patreon.com/alwaysplayer1podcast. Scruffy, what do they get for signing up? I mean, it's a pretty good reward, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a whole mini series on there called Planning Phase, which is a behind the scenes look at our decision making process for what games we cover in the main podcast. And don't forget to check out my YouTube playthrough that's up on my channel, links in the description, for The Wretched. It was a lot of fun recording it and putting it together, and it's pretty raw, pretty unedited, like I say. And yeah, it's exciting. I really enjoyed making it, and I was really... It's where I spilled all that bleed energy into right after recording the game.
And just a note on planning phase, it comes out every off week. So every week we don't release a podcast. We release an episode of planning phase, which is much smaller and much more rough around the edges because it's just us two chatting about what we should cover next. But if you do sign up to a Patreon, you won't have to wait 2 weeks to hear from us. You'll get a new episode every week, both the main podcast and planning phase. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for this.
One last thing. We did a special Halloween stream on Twitch. If you didn't catch that, it's up on my Twitch still. If you want to check out our top 10 lists for Halloween movies, and don't forget to follow me there if you want to see any live streams we do in the future. We often do Ironsworn on there, and I'm sure other things will pop into our stream in the future.
Yeah, and just thanks for everyone who joined us live on that one. If you didn't, it's not about games, it's about horror films. It's the Halloween special, but feel free to go check it out. As Scruffy said, links are in the description. I think that's everything for this episode, unless there's anything else you can think of.
No, I think that's all our crazy stunts for now. So thank you guys so much for listening. You're awesome. Have an awesome rest of your day.
Yeah, catch you in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon page. The links to that are in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.